Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Philip K. Dick's short story called The Skull, which was published in 1952. It's about a man named Conger who's in jail, but he has promised to be released from jail if he can go back in time, 200 years into the past, in a time capsule, to assassinate a man who had started an anti-war, very devoutly religious movement that believed that technology was the root of war, and therefore practiced this kind of spiritual asceticism that restricted technology, making it almost irrelevant to people's lives, stunting societal progress, undoubtedly. And this is, I think, where it starts to get a little bit more complicated, a little bit confusing. And I had to read the story a couple times because the man, after he gave the cult leader, after he gave his very famous speech that spurred on this movement, was then assassinated already by the police, and then he was resurrected, making his followers believe that he was divine. However, much later on in history, society changed to be pro-war and pro-technology, believing that the occasional war would rat out the unfit, had to purge the world of the unfit, and it was this very uber-rationalistic kind of society, like many of Philip K. Dick's worlds. And this was an example of a very kind of creepy allusion to some of the real historical theories that we've heard about, the Malthusianism, the Nazis, and etc. And basically, they want Conger to go back and kill this cult leader before he can give the speech that's not only spurred on the whole movement, but then got him killed by the police. And so he goes back in the time capsule, and then he has to bring a skull with him, the skull of the cult leader with him. And he has to use that as a way to identify the cult leader once he's gone back to that time period. But then once he goes back, he then realizes that he hasn't gone back far enough, because indeed the cult leader has already been killed by the police. So he goes back a little bit further to just those few moments before the cult leader's about to give his speech. And then in those moments, he's suspected of being a communist because of his weird accent, according to people, his weird way of dressing. And then, however, when he's looking into the eyes of the skull, he's looking at it, he realizes that cult leader is actually him. He's the one that's about to give the speech. And so he lets himself be killed, knowing that he will be resurrected in the new form, which then explains why he exists he then exists in the present of that uber-rationalistic society that he's in at the very beginning. So I would say that really the main reason why I'd recommend the story so much is because it does indeed feel like watching a documentary. And it also gets into the meat, like the real ugliness of why religious dystopias indeed are so delusional, and why their opposites, why their counterparts are indeed so delusional, in a way that at least a lot of the stories that I've seen don't really get into. It's like even things like The Handmaid's Tale, which talks about Christian patriarchy, a kind of a Puritan society, or anything else I can think of, doesn't really get at the core of it, which is that there are only two options that you're given. It's kind of like the red pill and the blue pill in the Matrix, right? It's like you're either given the option of what is called the moral path, the virtuous path, which is has to involve the denial of any kind of stimulation of any kind, believing that believing that essentially happiness, even though maybe it wouldn't phrase it that way, but the happiness is really the enemy of the good. Or alternatively, the only other alternative, if you actually want to be atheistic, is not just about, it's not even really striving to be happy as an alternative. Instead, is to basically completely drain your entire body and your entire soul of any kind of feeling or any detachment to anything, and believing that there must be a rational justification to anything, and not only that, but by any means, and something should be done by any means necessary. It doesn't matter how horrible the consequences are in the process, and there's never actually any kind of third option that is given to those things, which I think is what is so creepy about this particular world. And it does remind me, I think, of a lot of the things that as I was growing up, I would, in my, I have this sort of the, not dark fantasies in the sense that I would fantasize about myself being this way, but I would just come up with fantasy stories in my head, whether it would be for projects I was working on, that would very much involve these sort of dichotomies, and it makes, like I said, I think that it makes a lot of the other stories about religious patriarchy or its flip side seem more like very, very Hollywoody in comparison. And this, I think, arguably, I think it goes almost as deep as Orwell's 1984, because indeed shows how essentially the same problem can take many different forms, kind of like that creature It in the movie It. It's the same monster, but it can very cleverly, in this case, take many different political forms to serve whatever purpose that it wants.